computer, and then I'll share screen. So, step one, step two, there we go. All right, my friends, so we'll jump right into how does Jesus save. Again, this first slide's the same every week, right? It's seminal question in our faith, how does Jesus save us? But there's no definitive answer. No council has approved it or given final credence for everyone to say this is exactly how he saves. So there are 5 theories, and actually there's even argument about how many theories there are. There are 5, 6, or 3. It just depends on which person you're talking to on variations on a theme, but with lots of addendums and tweaks. So even if you were to say, talk about penal substitutionary atonement theory, there's penal substitutionary atonement theory and honor atonement theory and all these other kinds of ways of looking. So what we're going to do is look at one a week, and we've been doing that here for, gosh, 4 now already, and or 3. And then this week, the first week we covered substitutionary atonement, the dominant theory in the West. That's really what you hear preached. Certainly the Catholic Church has declared it dogma, and a good portion of the more evangelical sides of the church have proclaimed that. Then we looked at moral influence theory, which was a contemporaneous version, really a response to substitutionary atonement theory, and its tweaks to it. So it was working really hard to tweak it, and especially that angry God image that ends up happening so often with atonement, substitutionary atonement. And last week we looked at the Christus Victor theory, or the ransom theory, which is when we sin, we become subject to evil, subject to the devil, and Jesus has to either ransom us or conquer that evil, depending on which version you want to talk about. That's a quick overview, the 30-second overview of really amazingly complex theories, but the basics for them. Today we're going to talk about René Girard, who was born in Avignon in 1923. René Noël Théophile Girard. Great name. Again, Noel is just Christmas, so I'm assuming his family probably added that one when he was born on Christmas Day. Théophile actually is a God lover, so René, Christmas God lover Girard, right? He studied medieval history in Paris. We're going to look at him real quick because this theory is wrapped up in who he is as much as it is In 1947, he went to Indiana University for a fellowship and stayed in the States. He literally died 4 years ago, and spent his entire time teaching here in the States. He received a PhD from Indiana, taught at Duke for a couple of years, and he landed at Johns Hopkins, where he taught from 1957 to 1981, largely as a French professor, which is probably one of the fascinating things. He really was focused on French literature and history, but in the process of his literary studies started to develop this theory. He was then a professor at Stanford from 81 until his ultimately retirement from regular teaching from 81 to 95. You get an idea, there he is young, there he is in his older years. Girard's theory grew and expanded over his life. He published books until his death in 2015. I think at last count, he has 30 books attributed to him that he authored or co-authored over the course of his life. In 1966, he published his first major work titled Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. All right, so this is basically when this theory begins. Albeit in a little bit of a sideways process, and we'll see how that works. But he was an avowed agnostic. He really didn't go to church, believe in God, or have any connection to anything of faith from his own confession, and that sort of way that a lot of French will actually declare it. They're sort of nominally Christian, or my favorite terminology for where Europe is from Archbishop Rowan Williams, who says Europe is haunted by Christianity, that it's out there and around them, but there's not a real knowledge of what's happening. So, in his first book, that Desire, Deceit in the Novel, he looks at a concept that will become his baseline. Okay, so everything that Rene Girard gets into is ultimately titled Mimetic Theory, and we'll talk about how that works. So he notes that all books about people, and this again begins as a literary theory, all books are ultimately about people competing for one goal or another. The goals can be all sorts of different things, but there is this idea that most of the time, for that creative friction in novels, it ends up being people competing for one thing or another. Right? Even when one of them may not be all that interested in the good or in that sort of final goal, there is competition. To compete and push each other to see if they can't reach that goal. That could be a love interest, that could be oil or gold, it could be discovering who killed someone, that it's all the same kind of competition, right? But swerving from literary criticism into anthropology, he notes that this is how people learn and grow. We learn through competition, but it's even more deep than that. What he notices is human beings don't have many instincts. If you've ever had a child or been around a child, you know this is true. Kids will literally eat anything, put anything in their mouth. There's not that sort of natural instinct. If you see a photo or a picture or video of, I don't know, a zebra being born, the zebra falls to the ground and pretty much gets up and starts running behind mom to keep up and be safe with the herd, right? There's these immediate instincts that kick in for most animals, that they know what to do and how to do it. They don't have to be taught. A shark doesn't have to learn how to swim. It just starts swimming at birth, right? Humanity, on the other hand, has to literally seem to be taught almost everything for us to survive, from the biggest to the smallest of things. So we learn ultimately, and this is an anthropological theory, we ultimately learn by mimicking one another. Scientists think that maybe our true one instinct as human beings is imitation. That is, that we mirror people or things to learn how to do things. There's literally parts of our brain that are called mirror neurons that are programmed in such a way to help us see and mimic other people, see and copy what they're doing. It's also a big sign, if you've ever studied relationships, this is a certain sign of intimacy in a relationship when two people unintentionally starts to copy what the other one's doing, right? If one person starts to fix their hair, then the other person will also just sort of mimic and fix their own hair as well at the same time. These are all very natural kind of processes, and it's how human beings engage with the world. It's how we learn in the world. Put simply, and this is a really simplified version of it, here's how it works and why it probably was a helpful evolutionary trend. If you see someone avoid the purple berries, if you're out in the woods, as humanity was for most of our history, right? If you see someone avoid purple berries, then you will probably avoid purple berries as well. Even though they look nice and they look good, if someone doesn't eat the purple berries and walks past them, then you will probably walk past them too. That's a sort of combination of mirroring instinct, peer pressure, a little bit of both, right? If everybody does one thing, we sort of follow along. But human beings survived because we didn't eat the berries that were poisonous, right? Humanity learned over time what was good for us, what was bad for us. And so if your mom didn't eat the purple berries, then probably she would teach you that those were poisonous purple berries in time. But before that, before we're being taught, we actually just mirror it. And that's how that process works. We just gradually learn without being taught. It's all a mirroring instinct. That's our one instinct. So I'm going to pause there real quick, but this mimicking, this mirroring, this imitation is the root of Girard's theory of mimetic theory, right? So does anybody have any questions? This is really a very simplified version, but we can try and jump in a little bit more if anybody has questions about this first part, about just what is this idea of mirroring each other. No questions? Okay, no problem. As always, just stop me if there is something you need to ask, because we're going to jump in a little bit deeper now. So we learn through watching each other what to avoid, but we also learn what to desire, right? So on one hand, we learn don't eat the purple berries, but we also may go to the next bush and say, oh, but these raspberries or these blackberries are delicious and we really want these and we all want to eat these, right? And so scientists think that is why we are easily swayed by advertising. I mean, literally, we are hardwired to make and to imitate. And therefore, when someone comes on TV and says, I love this wonderful toothbrush, right? Or I love this wonderful car, then we are literally wired to say, oh, well, if somebody says it's a good car, I'll probably trust that. We've gotten a little bit more adept at some of that, right? We've gotten a little more adept at screening, but it's also why the holy grail for all advertising is to have people who will talk about their product to their friends, right? Like if you might see, I don't know, George Clooney talking about how this is great coffee, and some people will immediately buy it because they trust George Clooney. But if you're friends with Catherine, Mark, then all of a sudden that next thing is, how do we as a group trust that I recommend that coffee, then it's far more likely Margaret and Catherine will jump in and buy the coffee, right? This is how, again, this is how we're all wired. We trust each other and we sort of mimic and imitate, and especially if you trust and love someone, then you're even more predisposed to mimicking them, to imitating them, which is a good thing. That's not bad. But it makes us more susceptible to advertising. It makes us more susceptible to a whole host of things like that, right? So this mimetic desire is really where we begin. We desire the same things because we mimic, because we're taught to want them. To play that out a little, the problems arrive when we start to all want the same thing, right? So if we're all taught to desire a car, and it does, I mean, I'm picking from, there could be anything, right? But if we're all taught to love a red sports car.
Well, mine is not screen mirroring, it's off. I cut it off, but I can't get this to come up.
Hold on.
They just need to watch it, and we're going to not even be able to hear it.
Hey, Mom and Dad, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Oh!
We can't see you. We just got to where we can hear you.
Yeah, well, that's okay. We'll get to it. You can listen.
Okay, we'll be quiet. Listen.
So, the whole idea behind mimetic desire is, at first, it's good because we're being taught to value things. We're taught to care about things. But then on the negative side is if we start to get in competition for things. So if we're all taught to desire the same thing, let's say a red sports car, then what happens next is we start to compete for that sports car, right? We start to throw an elbow or get angry, and we start to compete with someone who also wants that red sports car because there's only so many red sports cars in the world. This is where it's a process that becomes mimetic rivalry, right? We start to fight with each other because there's not enough houses on the beach. There are not enough sports cars. There's not enough whatever the clothes, shirt, pants, whatever it is. And it's all part of this idea that we learn, we share that mimetic desire, we learn from one another, but then that desire can lead us into places where we end up competing for resources, for food, for money, for power. Whatever it is we've been taught to value, we then end up in a rivalry situation. So even, the funny thing is, the way we're wired is, even if we don't ultimately want the red car, the fact that the other person wants it so desperately proves that the car is worthwhile, right? This is the way it gets sort of reinforced with us as human beings. On the one hand, I don't really care about that red sports car. But Casey really, really wants that sports car, and so does Mary Vaughn. So maybe that proves that that car has more worth than I thought it did in the first place. And you get drawn back in, even through the competition itself. It starts to perpetuate in that rivalry and in that competition. All right, so that's mimetic desire. That in turn leads to mimetic rivalry, right? We start to fight and push on that. So, questions about those first two steps, because then it leads to the next. We've got mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry. Okay. So, the next part of that, and I didn't really include it here, we'll talk about it a little bit later, is it ends up, but if we all desire that sports car, we all want that sports car, we start to compete for that sports car. In time, what it leads to is outright conflict for that car. There's only so many resources and only so many ways to do it. People start to fight over that car or fight over that extra piece of bread, right? Or whatever those things might be, because we've been taught to desire it. We then figure out other people are competing with us to get it, and we start to get worried about that. And then it actually becomes outright conflict where the original object is almost forgotten, and we just start fighting with each other about whatever it is that we want to fight about, and it grows in intensity. So Girard himself found himself sympathetic. One of the works that he loves Dostoevsky, and found himself sympathetic to all these things and began to understand Christianity in these terms. He started to realize that this is how we viewed the world in terms of mimetic rivalry and competition, mimetic desire. And his mimetic theory led him to a conversion after he wrote this book to Christianity. So this is one of the rare things we can say for any of the theories. It actually led the author to become a Christian. He became a devout Catholic from that point on to his death, like I said, about 4 years ago. So you have this fascinating thing where he really starts to understand faith through this lens that we are in competition. We share this desire. We get into a rivalry situation. We compete, and then there are ways that it starts to play out. All right. So he began to understand his conversion and faith in terms of mimetic theory. That is, in his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, he focuses on literature to explain mimetic theory. But in his second book, Violence and the Sacred, it was published in 1972, he began to turn to view mimetic theory and religion, right? So in life, in his personal life, his first book led him to become a Christian. In the second book, Violence and the Sacred, he began to realize that religion and mimetic theory was connected, all sort of combined in his personal exploits and in his study and work as a professor. So he focused mainly at first on Greek myths and plays, and he noticed these similar patterns, right? That people would be taught that they needed to desire something. Then they would start to have a mimetic rivalry. That is, they would start to pair off and push each other, and then it would lead into outright conflict. And there are lots of these stories that shared mimetic desire would lead to mimetic rivalry, like I said. And then ultimately this would create so much energy that people fighting back and forth, that the only way that you could stop this sort of spiraling situation where people would compete with each other and fight each other and then want things even more because that proved that the other person wanted it more, the only way you could end mimetic rivalry often enough was through a sacred violence, is what he called it, or sacrifice, right? You had to appease the gods to get this whole thing taken care of, usually killing someone or a character coming to a deep realization that what they were doing was wrong and they needed to switch things around. That is in his book, The Violence and the Sacred, which was a seminal book. This literally is one of the most widely read of his books, and it's because he focuses on Greek myth, it looms large, and it's become literally, if you are a one of my old youth group kids is now a professor of Greek literature and classics at Arizona State. And when I was talking about Rene Girard one time, he said, "Oh man, that is the book everyone in my field has to read and understand, Violence and the Sacred, because it is considered such an important work for understanding Greek myth and legend." As he lectured on Violence and the Sacred, his friends asked him to examine the Bible, to do the same thing, which he was already working on, was how does this idea of violence being connected to sacred sacrifice, to ritualistic sacrifice, how is that connected to what our text says, right? What does the Judeo-Christian model have to say about violence? So Girard spent the next several years exhaustively analyzing the Old and New Testament. And then he published just a few years after his, 72 is when he published that last book, Violence and the Sacred. 78, he published what's considered his magnum opus, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, a very humble title, to say. So he writes almost 30 more books to clarify his theory after the after that initial book. He writes lots more to help explain it, but that the big one really is Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, where he gets into this theory, the Bible specifically. So for Girard, he had gone through first literature, looking at all sorts of different literature, then Greek myth, but he gets to the Bible, to Scripture, and says, here, this is what we missed. This is what all these other authors have missed. But the Bible and its truth has to say about humanity, right? Like literature, Mimetic Theory hits all its regular notes. That is, first, people ought to desire the same thing, a love for God, or to value your wife, or to value your spouse, or to value a wide variety of things. Then we end up, because we're taught to like and support the same things, we end up in this rivalry situation where we start to compete with each other. It leads and turns to conflict. It then eventually escalates to outright violence that we have to then dial back or figure out what to do with. But for Girard, he said the Scripture gives us the ultimate missing link, and that is the innocence of the victim. Right? With Jesus, that's explicit. Jesus is innocent of any crime. He's prosecuted and killed despite being innocent. That's the great horrible moment of the crucifixion, and he says that's exactly what we need to focus on. So to explain that, he goes back and talks a little bit more about Greek myth. So Oedipus, if you remember that play by Sophocles, there is mimetic desire leading to rivalry. That is, I mean, not to get too far into it, but all people desire the same things. Oedipus desires love, but it leads to rivalry, and in turn that rivalry leads to conflict until someone is punished and killed. Oedipus is blinds himself and is cast out. The whole idea, right? So it has this idea of there's a similar desire, it leads to rivalry, conflict, and then ultimately there's this sacred violence that takes out the energy, that negative energy in the system. Often the victim of that violence, in this case, like in Oedipus was guilty. He was guilty of sin. He was guilty of the offense. And so in a lot of those Greek myths and tragedies, there is a person who is at fault, right? Or there's a declaration that that group or people are at fault. Here's where Scripture is different. Girard claims that Jewish and Christian Scripture alter that pattern. The victim of communal and religious violence is typically innocent. All these victims that when people start to say, oh, it's this person's fault or that person's fault, all these folks are actually innocent of the crime of which they are accused. He says this is the seminal and important declaration of Jewish and Christian Scripture. He later writes another book to specify that, but he calls it the scapegoat. And the nice thing about this is you don't have to read all 185 pages or so of the scapegoat. I can just say scapegoat, and hopefully all of you know what that means, right? That there are these moments in time in history where people get angry about a variety of things. There's problems in our society. Then someone points at someone or one part of
some group, like white people.
Right, absolutely. They point at a group. And so this mimetic desire leads to mimetic rivalry. It leads to that mimetic conflict. And then each level ratchets up with violence and anger. People get all angry and they get more and more angry. And the only way to disperse that anger is an innocent target takes the energy to calm that whole system, right? This is his theory. And like Mary said, if we take it out of religion, we can see it all the time. Our LGBT QI Americans, our African American brothers and sisters, Asian Americans, Hispanic and Latinx, dirty immigrants, right? All of these things, and that's not just to say right now. We've been blaming immigrants for 150 plus years in America for all of our problems, that all of these groups get scapegoated, right? There is an economic downturn. It is the fault of one of those groups, right? The easy political ploy to, instead of addressing a really complex, perhaps economic situation, you just blame a group of people so that the energy and the anger around one thing is dispersed on a group that often enough is innocent, at least innocent of what they're being accused in relation to that. They become scapegoats where they take on a almost sacred part of this ritual. That is, they take away that anger or they absorb it in a way, even though they have nothing to do with it. This is the heart of Girard's theory, that we have this whole way human beings act. And it's not just in large, it can be in small groups, it can be in families even, right? Families will get mad about a whole variety of things, and then somebody goes, well, it's all Aunt Edna's fault, or whoever's fault. And you start to blame people, even though they probably didn't have anything to do with the actual problems or the fight or the situation. You just start to blame someone. So there's a place to direct that anger or that anxiety, that conflict, that energy. So Girard proclaims that the Bible wants to reveal our broken and sinful way of working in this world. That's his basic idea. Here's this whole way that he sees, patterns that he sees in literature, in myth and legend, in religion, and ultimately in our just modern world that happens over and over and over again. And his understanding is our salvation comes by trying to reveal that broken model, that God sends Jesus as the ultimate innocent victim to help us see it. That's the whole point of Scripture and the whole point, as Girard sees it, that Jesus is killed because that is what humans do to innocents. People who are innocent, to scapegoats. It is not like we have seen in some of the other situations where God demands the death of Jesus. That is, God absolutely does not in this situation. Instead, God sends Jesus to be a loving, accepting force for good in the world, and God knows that ultimately evil will respond by, and we will respond, right? Human beings even will respond by attacking the innocent, by pointing out the scapegoat and immediately pouring all of our hate and anger and frustration on that individual or on that group of people. So again, God in this case is not evil, but humanity is. We're evil because this is how we deal with our stress and our anxiety. Instead of finding healthy ways and appropriate ways to deal with our stress and anxiety, we push it out on each other and we take it out on each other. So the whole point in this case is the incarnation, that is Jesus' entire life is now really understood as a way for us to live a life that is without competition. To emulate Christ in a situation is to find ways to love in the hardest of situations and to get away from mimetic rivalry, mimetic conflict, and ultimately the scapegoat mechanism. So Jesus gives the positive option of imitation. He comes in the same way that we learn everything, right? He comes to say, mimic me, follow me, imitate me. I think I mentioned this in a previous class. If you don't know in Greek, the Greek word for follow me is akalutheo. Acolyte comes from it. Follow me. The acolyte follows the cross, as what we are called to follow. So Girard, in his theory, believes that Jesus' full life, his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection, the whole kit and caboodle, reveals a better way to be human. And this is where it does differ critically from several other theories, is it really does, Jesus' whole incarnation is now sacred instead of it just being his bloody death on Good Friday, right? All Good Friday does, all that bloody death does, is reveal to us. It holds a mirror up to our evil, is what it really does, right? We are revealed as the forces of anger and hate. We are the ones who yell, "Crucify him," right? As we reenact every Good Friday. We are the ones who injure those around us, especially groups that are different than us. And we're called to do better, to be better. So Christ is our positive mediator, the one to base our lives upon. And then in turn, we are called to condemn all forms of scapegoating and ultimately all forms of violence. Right? If we see scapegoating, then we should go, oh, this is like what we learned with Jesus. This group, this community is being unfairly persecuted and told that they are at fault when really we know they've done nothing wrong. In this case, it is literally the sacred job of Christians and of Jews to stand up and to say, no, God has declared that the innocent should not be killed simply because they're different, simply because we are angry about 12 other things. All right, so that is the broad stroke of Girardian theory. Questions about that? We'll jump in and look at some of the problems with Girard, as well as the ways it's actually impacting a lot of stuff going on right now. It's a heavy theory, that's for sure. It's complex. All right. Again, stop me if you have questions, but now we'll start to look at some of the questions. So Girardian theory has some amazingly powerful supporters. He has become one of the major theories in the last 60 years, 50 years, has become a major force in Christian thought. Rowan Williams, who I mentioned earlier, actually uses his theory extensively in his writings. When he was Archbishop of Canterbury, he was all into it. And would talk about it, and still preaches and teaches it in a variety of ways. And again, part of it that makes it super relevant is the scapegoat theory keeps coming up over and over again. It is constantly proven to be relevant in everyday life. Almost everything we see that is dealing with the protests in our world right now, it is part of it. Here's the other way that it is relevant, and it's irrelevant in a way that might surprise us. And Girard engaged this, right? He started to say, the key with the scapegoat theory is once we understand that this is how evil works in the world, if we understand that we scapegoat others and we proclaim it, then it gets oversimplified. It becomes this idea like, oh, well, if you're a victim, then you are innocent or you are right. And Girard would say that's absolutely not true. There's one innocent victim in Jesus Christ, and everyone else has some level of sin or brokenness or hurt. Doesn't mean people should be prosecuted or scapegoated or injured, but it is where we have to be very careful not to immediately just nuts and bolts say, if you're a victim, if you're offended, you are right. And this is the kind of classic thing. If you remember a few years ago, we had everything that happened in Charlottesville, where the KKK was, and the alt-right and all those kinds of groups protesting and talking about how that it wasn't fair for this and it wasn't fair for that. But if you listen very closely to their rhetoric, very closely to the rhetoric of neo-Nazis and to the white power movement, they proclaim themselves as victims. And it's purely because of this. They've realized scapegoat, even though that's sort of the bread and butter of lots of those movements, right? To say it's all black folks' fault, it's all Catholics or Jews, or go down the list that a lot of the KKK and alt-right movement have proclaimed. They'll absolutely use scapegoating, but then they've also learned that if you're the victim, then you have greater moral authority. And so that at the same time that they're scapegoating, they're also claiming to be the victim in that process. And their rights are being impinged on, that the government is not protecting them, that they are being oppressed, that they are being beaten down. It's the perfect way to see how this scapegoat theory then can be twisted and used in a weird ways to undo what we're supposed to be doing as Christians, which is stand up for those who are truly scapegoated, truly those who have been pushed to the sides or marginalized or injured purely because they are different, right? And it also then brings up the greater question of God's truth in the midst of that versus what we declare is truth or what we declare is right. And just because you happen to be on the other side of that, you are a victim. And that's where it gets much slippier, much more slippery, as you might imagine, even from my description just now. It makes me nervous when I say all that. It is not Girardian theory to talk about if you were the victim, you were right. Girard is focused on the innocence of the victim, and especially the innocence in that situation. To go on a darker conversation, it's to say there are times when someone can be guilty of things, and we are all guilty of sin. But when Emmett Till is killed basically for being black, he is innocent of the crime of doing something evil to the community. He was a good person, and he was innocent of all that. He was taking on that scapegoating situation, right? Martin Luther King, for instance, was not a perfect man. There, he had his ups and downs.
Hey,
he would always share, but he would not then. But he was innocent of anything to be executed or assassinated in Memphis in '68, right? This is how this kind of process works. It's not to say that every victim is completely innocent of everything of the crime of which they typically are accused or for which they're persecuted for. Which, if you go back to the alt-right and they say, "Oh, well, we're victims of the larger community hating us," and you go, "Well, because what you're proclaiming is hate, so you're actually being accused of something, or you're being persecuted for something that is accurate about what you proclaim and believe." It's a different thing. Even if you try to claim victimhood in it, Girard would say, in this theory, that's not how it works. But we're also starting to see the problems with Girardian theory, right? It gets complex. It's complex to explain it. I just spent 20-odd slides and a good 30, 40 minutes trying to give you the most basic idea of the theory. Whew. Now, so it's not an easy one or straightforward one to work with. And the critiques here are very much the same as the moral influence theory, right? So in the moral influence theory, it's the same idea. We are called as Christians to follow Jesus to make the world a better place. That's very simple influence theory. And sometimes people will combine these two. They have very different models, but the ultimate idea is the same, that through Jesus' whole life, the world is made a better place. And if we just follow Jesus more clearly or are more connected and can do this work better, then the world in turn will be saved as well. The problem is the same, right? We stink at doing this. There's concentration camps, there's segregation, there's go down the list. Or Paul probably says it best in Romans, I can do what is right. I can will, that is, what is right. I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. They're more human response, honest human response to the way we live our lives. There's lots of times when we say, I need to go do this, and then we end up realizing we did the opposite. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes just not even paying attention. We get caught up in this pattern of evil. And that's the greatest critique of Girard is, great, okay, so now we know about scapegoating, but who is the person who's brave enough to stand in front of a mob trying to kill someone and say, you're scapegoating this guy, you need to leave him alone, knowing full well that you might be killed as well? It's not an easy road, nor is it even one that may work all the time. So we divorce God from evil and violence. We really need God. And in this theory, we absolutely divorce God. And this is why I love this theory. God can in no way be evil or violent. It's all about humanity, fallenness, and brokenness. It's all about this sort of either abstract or personalized evil in the world. But we really, really need God's help to make it through, because like Paul said, we can know what we need to do. We know we need to stop scapegoating one group or another. But man, we keep scapegoating people left and right all the time. Sometimes even any of us might end up scapegoating for silly reasons or huge reasons. Again, the other issue really is it's not easy to preach. It took him 30 books to finalize, and even then, I imagine if he lived another 100 years or so, he probably would still be writing books trying to massage his theory, understand his theory, and put it out there. And it's more complicated. It gets into a lot of philosophical arguments and details, and it's a complex theory. It's really hard to preach or to teach. And then the ultimate question, some people just say, is really, so we couldn't figure this out for 2,000 years. We had to wait for Rene Girard to come along and give us a complex theory to finally figure out how Jesus saves. It's one of those great questions that log of this theory. So, full disclosure, I wrote my thesis for my master's degree on Rene Girard. I love his work. Again, I love the fact that I love any atonement theory where God is not. I would like to say that God can save us without doing evil or endorsing violence. And I also wonder, and this is what I've struggled with multiple times as I've tried to engage it or as I try to preach it. I can't preach this in a 7 to 12 minute sermon, right? There's no way you can easily say all the things I just said in 7 to 12 minutes to make it accessible and to say this is why it's important. But that said, he does have some great work and some great theory. Next week, we'll look at the physical or mystical theory of atonement. That's the one other theory that we haven't covered. And we'll look at that, and then we'll probably have one more class after that just to say, okay, so we went through all these different theories of atonement. What do we do with this stuff? How should we engage it? That's the basics for atonement theory. I'll go back to everyone on the screen. Questions, thoughts, comments. It's like I said, Girard is not an easy cat to walk through, but would love to see or hear what y'all might have to say about him.
Bill,
Yes.
if you see yourself as a victim,
Mm-hmm.
is it not possible that you then lump the other person, the person whom you see yourself as a victim of, that's hard to say,
Right.
Into a group and scapegoat that group, rather than getting right down to the problem of your victimhood? Does that make any sense at all?
Absolutely. I mean, part of again, this is the sort of shadow side that Girard started to struggle with as, quite frankly, as popular culture started to get in this zone of, some of his critiques literally were sometimes directed even at Oprah, right? That it's always like, this person oppressed me, or I need to understand why you were so angry about this. And then when you claim that victimhood, it does end up claiming the shadow side of saying, well, anyone who injured me is evil, right? And suddenly that what you've done is reintroduce the violence that's supposed to be getting out of the system. And it's also not what Girard would say, that's not what God calls us to do. It's not about proclaiming your victimhood. It's about trying to claim your humanity and your connectedness that is far more important, that reconciliation that is much more God's work than the victimhood. And
where does Girard come with forgiveness? I mean, if I'm a victim, am I not also supposed to forgive?
Absolutely. I mean, he would point to Christ on the cross and say, Christ forgave, and so we too are called to forgive. Knowing that that's almost impossible a lot of times, especially when you truly are a victim.
Yeah, you bet. Always when you're a victim.
When you are truly a victim, it is really hard to say I forgive, and especially when it's an ongoing trauma, an ongoing violence. That's not an easy thing to say I forgive and to say it's okay. And I think that's a lot of the marches and the movement we see right now is for communities of color. They're mad because it's sort of, this keeps happening and it doesn't go away, right? And it's hard to say I forgive or I'm ready to move on to the next thing when, I mean, if you watch the news, 2 days later somebody else gets injured or police, or a variety of things happen that are one tragedy after another. And so there's this real difficulty we would all have in those situations of saying, how do I forgive when I'm being still being persecuted, when I'm still being the scapegoat, when I'm still being the victim? And it's one of the real things that Girard struggled with in a lot of his writings is how does that victimhood trap the victim and trap the oppressor, right? That dialogue
Exactly.
will trap both. It's hard to get out of that situation. But it's also then where he points and says, this is why we have to claim Christ. Actually, it's not necessarily what he would say, but in a book called Resurrection by Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, he points again and again and says the real key that we have to name as Christians is even when we are victims, even when we are oppressed, even when we are injured, we still have to name that Jesus alone is the innocent victim, right? The pure and innocent victim. That we may be innocent of whatever's happening to us that day or whatever's put us in this hard relationship, but that we have to go back to Christ as one who is both with us in that victimhood, but even more says there's more to this world than being a victim. And so these are those things that's super easy to say, but if you're dealing with being a victim, if you're dealing with being injured, it is a far more heart, it's heart thing more than a head thing even, right? You're hurting and it's hard to jump out of that heart hurt into a space where you can start to say, how do I forgive and release and let go?
I think one of my most insightful moments, one of my most Jesus moments was when during a legal proceeding, somebody lied about me. And on the way back from my lawyer's office, I realized that the same thing had happened to Christ. And that only he could understand and help me forgive and deal with it.
Absolutely.
Oh. Need to be so painful.
So yeah, this is what you're tapping down, Elizabeth, is exactly that that exact power of this theory to name scapegoating models, to name victimhood, and to engage these really, really deep questions. It's the power of this theory. But it definitely, like I said, the hard part though is explaining this theory and really wrestling with it, as well as in turn, how do we engage it in a way that helps us? It's sometimes naming is important, but even more, how does this assist us with salvation? How does this assist us with making the world a better place? Which is not as easy.
No.
Not at all. Any other questions we have? This is great stuff. Well, all right, my friends, thank you for sharing. It's so good to see all your faces and hear from you. Like I said, we'll meet next week and the following week, the next two, and sort of go through the last little bit of this. But it's good to be with you. I hope you all have a blessed day, and I hope you had a great 4th. We'll see you soon. God bless.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.